Welcome everybody. So today we are talking about social support part 2. So the first thing that I'll do is to give a recap of part 1, and then I will dive into part 2, which will also connect nicely with gender and sexuality on Thursday. Okay, so again, just to recap, social bonds are crucial to healthy human development. The way that we attach and relate to others has lifelong consequences. And most of this learning and attachment comes from the immediate home with parents. Thinking about, for example, the Harlow monkey studies, child development studies. Social support refers to the clarity of which you feel loved, valued, and able to count on others. And the amount of social support you have and the amount of social support that you feel relates to your social statuses. So marital status, gender, socioeconomic status, etc. Social support is one of 3 most important constructs in current mental health research. The other 2 being stress, coping, and social support. And that social support is only artificially separated from instrumental and material support. And so it's very normal for a parent to provide, not just emotional support or perceived support, but also to provide material support. And so though we typically separate out social support from instrumental and material, there can be a lot of overlap. So if any of this sounds too surprising to you, stop this video right now and send me an email. Let's do office hours, because at this point, this should really just be a recap of what we talked about on Thursday. Again, just a quick review because this will come up again. The major types of social support are perceived, structural, and received. So received support is the actual amount of social support that a person benefits from. It's actually not as important as perceived and structural support. So if we think of perceived support as emotional support, it's the subjective belief or appraisal that one belongs to a communicative and caring social network. Structural support then refers to more the organization of individual ties. So how frequently you speak with your friends, how long you've known them, the degree of reciprocity, and it can also refer to the size of your network, homogeneity of your network. So are your friends the same gender as you? Are most of your friends also students? Did most of your friends grow up in the same neighborhood? So the structural part of your support system is really the system and support system, whereas perceived support is some more the more what you think of as the support part of it. And then again, received is the actual support that you get, keeping in mind that your perception of how much support you have actually tends to be more impactful for your mental health than how much support you actually get. So the sense that, if someone says, I'm there for you if you ever need anything, that actually can carry more weight than whether that person can actually be there for you if you were to need something. And then the last recap slide before I will go into the second part of social support. So there are 2 ways to explain why perceived support is the most important. There is the situation-specific model, which basically just says that we use social support to cope to particular stressful events. And so if you lose a job or you become terminally ill or a loved one passes away, or if you just have a bad day, that's situation-specific social support. That if something bad happens, you can count on somebody to be there. However, there's also the developmental perspective. And so that is, the extension of child development studies, where it's not just how much support do you perceive you have right now, but how much support have you had over time. And so it's not contradictory. It's not that it's situation specific or developmental. Really, it's both. The idea being that our perceptions of social support are about who we have in our support system now, and also what we had long ago. And what's important to note about these models is they both locate the social environment as the primary source of supportive experiences. Okay. So understanding the connection between social support and mental health, part 2. So take a second and just think to yourself, how might self-esteem relate to perceived social support? So this is an opinion-based question, but I want you to put a little bit of effort into it. So let's say at least write a couple sentences, 3 sentences or so. So it's huge. I'm going to go into this, and this matters, especially as we talk about gender and sexuality and race and intersectionality. Thinking about self-esteem is going to come up. And if you think about it intuitively, it kind of makes sense. If you feel really, really bad about yourself, it's going to be harder for you to expect that other people would want to be there for you. Versus if you think about your most conceited friend or most conceited person you've ever met, they probably thought that everybody would be there for them and should be there for them, that they're the center of the universe. But people who have really low self-esteem typically don't think that they are the center of the universe, and they might perceive their social support to be lower. And this can be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so whether you perceive others as being supportive or not can reflect your stable personality characteristics. So if you expect that everybody in your life will drop what they're doing to attend to your needs, whether it's you losing a job or you just having a bad day, that's probably a reflection that you have a pretty self-assured sense of self. If you feel that, you could be diagnosed with a terminal illness and nobody would even pick up the phone call for you, that's probably a reflection partially of how you view yourself and your self-esteem. And so remember, social support is information that you are loved and wanted, valued and esteemed, and able to count on others. And so if you don't feel that you are loved and wanted, if you don't feel that you are valued and esteemed, then think about it. It could be really hard to think that you could also then count on others. So then we have reflected appraisals. So this is actually a psychology term. And if you're familiar with it, then good job bringing in extra knowledge. It just refers to a person's perception of how others see them. And so this basically asserts that we come to think of ourselves the way that others think of us, the reflected appraisal. So we appraise ourselves in reflection to how we think others see us, which again relates to how we see ourselves. And so if you see yourself as somebody who is worthwhile, contributes to your environment, and advances humanity in the right direction, then you might expect that other people see you that way as well. If you see yourself as a burden, a failure, a disappointment, then you might think that others see you that same way. That's a reflected appraisal, that the way that you think others appraise you is a reflection of how you actually see yourself. And again, we can see how reflected appraisals relate to social support and self-esteem, because if you have a really low appraisal of yourself, you might assume that others do too. And then that might make you less likely to reach out or even, again, perceive that you have the support. Because it's not just the support you'll get. It's the perceived support, the emotional support. And so whether people would be there for you or not isn't actually what it's about. It's whether you would perceive them to be there for you if you were to need it. So we have then what's called reciprocal causation. So the experience of being supported by others can make your self-esteem stronger. However, if your self-esteem is strong, it makes you more likely to believe that you'll be supported by others. And so we tend to vary in our tendency to derive emotional sustenance from positive regard and affection. So think about the friend who shoots down every attempt for you to make them feel better. Your friend is not feeling great, and every single thing that you say to them, your friend just shoots it down. You might have a thought that, wow, they're really hard on themselves. Their self-esteem is really low. And so if you have low self-esteem, that's what SE is here. If you have low self-esteem, you'll be less likely to perceive that you have people who think that you are loved, valued, and you can count on them. And then if you perceive that you don't have people to be there for you, that can further decrease your self-esteem. And so when I say reciprocal causation, I mean it's a causal relationship. Low self-esteem causes you to feel that you have low social support, and low social support causes you to have lower self-esteem. It's causation, but it's reciprocal. It's kind of a self-fulfilling situation. And so self-esteem contributes to differences and receptiveness. The capacity to experience the esteem of others has to require some minimum level esteem of self. So what we have then is support schemata. And so when I say schemata or schema, that's just a cognitive framework that helps organize and interpret information. So if I were to say gender schema, that's how we, organize and interpret information about gender. In this sense, a support schemata is the way that we sort information about social support in a social environment. And so knowledge structures are basically, support schemata are just knowledge structures about whether people will be able to meet our needs or not. So basically your working knowledge, your mental framework of what support looks like in your life. So this encompasses whether the environment will provide aid or not. And this is rooted in early attachment. So how comfortable you feel reaching out to people. At a base level, how much you expect people in your environment to be there for you if you need them. That's rooted in attachment theory and child development studies. And so if you had a very distant upbringing, for example, and you were raised to believe that you can only count on yourself and you cannot count on your parents to comfort you and provide a source of support, you're probably going to be more likely to avoid asking for help in the future, or be less likely to ask for help in the future. However, if you were raised in an environment where you were encouraged to ask for help, where you were rewarded for asking for help, then you're going to be more likely in your adult years to feel comfortable asking for help. And so that schema, that knowledge framework about when it's appropriate to ask for help, when people should be there for you if you need it, that's really rooted in attachment theory. And that's not the only thing. Again, like I mentioned, there are themes around race and gender and marital status and socioeconomic status. So it's not just an attachment, but a lot of these origins of these schema are rooted in early experience with attachment, especially to parents. And so this tends to self-replicate. So if you expect that others will be supportive, you're also going to be more likely to create supportive relationships in new settings, which will then confirm the expectation that others are likely to be supportive, which will then increase your likelihood of creating supportive relationships in new social settings. On the other end, if you expect that nobody will be supportive, then it's going to make you less likely to reach out in new situations. If you don't reach out in new situations, then you don't form new relationships, which will then confirm your original belief that there isn't support, which will then decrease your likelihood of trying to form supportive relationships. And so it really can be a self-replicating feedback loop. This relationship between support and mental health has been confirmed time after time after time. Nothing I've said to you, I'm sure you've learned some things, hopefully you've learned some things, but I doubt that anything I've said to you has been very surprising. I've probably said things that might have been enlightening or have nuanced some things you already knew, but I probably haven't told you anything that doesn't intuitively make sense. Social support relates to mental health. Knowing that people are there for you if you need them makes you feel comforted. The sense that if something went wrong, you have nobody to turn to can make you feel pretty bad. Most sociological research on social support tends to be studies about depression. So quality of life related outcomes, the general hypothesis being that the lower your sense of social support, the higher your risk for depressive symptoms. The opposite is true. The more social support you have, the less at risk you are for depressive symptoms. However, the specific links about social support and mental health, so the mechanisms of social support, the intricacies of social support, we don't understand those as much, but the baseline relationship that the more social support you have, the less at risk you are for depressive symptoms, that's been tried and true. And so if we think about the causal effect, it's not just that. So social support is typically studied as a buffer. So you have all of these other life stressors going on, and stressors are inevitable, but depression's not inevitable. Social support acts as a buffer. However, what we also find is that social support is a main effect. It's not just a buffer against stress, but it's actually a main contributor or a main factor in whether a person experiences depressive symptoms. And so research tells us that the lower social support you have, the higher risk for depression, even when there are no stressors. So even without the main effect of a stressor, even without you losing your job, even if everything in your life is quote unquote great, you can still have a higher risk for depressive symptoms, even if everything is great, if you perceive that nobody is there for you. And so, yes, it is true that if you are stressed, if you lose your job, if you have an illness, if your kid or your cat is sick, that will put you at higher risk for depression. But even without those stressors, if you don't perceive that you have people who would be there for you, hypothetically, if something were to go wrong, that in itself can cause you to be depressed. And so in that way, social support is a main effect. It's relevant in all circumstances, whether or not stress is present. Social support has an impact on mental health, even in the absence of any stress. And so basically, the positive benefits of social support exist even when stress does not. And so even if nothing is wrong, knowing that people were there for you will have an impact on your mental health. And so that's why I have these diagrams here. So the top diagram is the buffer diagram. I did make these myself. So like, don't give me a hard time about it. I mean, don't give me a hard time, okay? If you look at the top one, that's kind of the buffer model. So stress exposure, let's think of that again as losing a job. Or, we'll say failing a test. So stress exposure is failing a test. Psychological well-being would be, getting depressed because you failed the test. The perceived social support is the buffer. So yeah, you failed the test. But if you have friends who say, it's okay, I failed that test too, but I still graduated, or yeah, I took retook the class as well, but I got an A next time. If you have people there supporting you, even though you failed that test, you might not become depressed. So having friends who also experience something similar, or having a mentor who can provide you with advice, that can buffer you against depression. However, even if you don't fail the test, even if there is no test at all, just knowing that there are people who were in your situation before or who could give you advice will also improve your psychological well-being. And so the top diagram is the buffer model, and then we see at the bottom is the main effect model. And again, it's both. It's a buffer and a main effect, but don't fall into the trap of thinking that social support only matters if there is stress. It does not. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this part of the lecture, and then we'll have one more after this. In summary, for this part, social support matters for psychological well-being in general, independent of stress. It does matter more when there is stress. And so, yes, having a support system will matter more if you lose a job, if a parent becomes ill, if you have a terminal illness. And so I'm not saying that stressor or not, it's the same thing. However, it's not just a buffer. It is a main effect in the sense that even without stress, it still matters. But yes, if you are stressed, it's going to matter even more. And so this hypothesis holds true across subgroups. And so even if we're talking about gender, sexuality, racial differences, this general hypothesis holds true, although we do see some nuances. And in terms of nuance, we'll talk about gender and sexuality on Thursday. I believe race and class are next week, and then I think we have intersectionality in week 5. Either way, if you're interested in the nuances of social support, we'll talk about that more. So I am going to stop this right here, and I will record lecture number 2 of 2 right after. See you soon.